I'm Jim Schaefer, the producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Ross Chambers, who's here to discuss his book, Facing It, AIDS Diaries and the Death of the Author. Ross, this is one of those books that really needs to have some kind of context provided for the discussion before we can really go further. Perhaps you could tell us which diaries you selected and the basis for the discussion in this book, and something about the author of each diary.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll start talking a little bit about myself, since it's obviously a bit ironic to be talking to the author of a book about the death of the author. It's perfectly normal in our culture to give authority to authors over their text, and if you're running a book show, to invite the author to comment on what he or she might think it means.
Yeah.
But equally, the very fact that we're doing this is a token of the, I suppose, the obvious fact that it's now out of my, that the book is now out of my hands, it's out of my control. I have died as far as the book is concerned, and it has life of its own, so what I can say about it is what I can say about it, but what it means and where it's going and what impact it has or doesn't have is going to depend on many kinds of forces that are quite out of my control, and that I'm really not very, not even trying to control, let's put it that way. The way I started to write this book was I began to write an essay in memory of a friend of mine who had died, not of AIDS, in fact. But this friend had, throughout her life, displayed amazing courage in the face of various forms of life's difficulties and adversities and ordeals. And I thought I wanted to write something about the way she just withheld her assent from the horrible things that life has in store for many of us. Throughout her life, she simply did not put up with it. She did not accept these things. And rather than doing it directly by writing about Mary, I thought I would write about Eric Michaels, who was an American anthropologist, quite young, who went to Australia to work with a group of Warlpiri Aboriginals in Australia. Did his field work for more than field work, he worked for 5 years with those people, and then almost immediately after that began to experience the first real symptoms of AIDS, and it was early days in the epidemic, 1987. So he had about a year left to live, and he spent that year, on the one hand, writing his life's work, writing up his work with the Warlpiri, and on the other hand, keeping a diary of the experience of dying of AIDS. So I thought I would approach talk about Mary indirectly by working with Eric Michaels' story and with his book. And that project turned out to be more than I could contain in the limits of a really short essay, and so it became a small book instead, because I immediately began to think about other diaristic, if that's a word, pieces of writing that came out of the AIDS epidemic in various countries at more or less the same period. They all come from I tend to call it the heroic period of the AIDS epidemic, when there was virtually no treatment, and it was very scary indeed, and that's when most of the diary writing occurred. Needless to say, there's been a huge amount of AIDS writing in general, The diary is simply one subspecies, subgenre of that writing. But it interested me particularly from the point of view of the refusal of assent that's entailed in witnessing in general and in deciding to do a diary of your own death in particular. And because I'm a literary critic by profession, I was interested, as you know, in the really curious way that the theoretical understanding of the author's death, once you have written something, the writing takes over and the author's meanings and intentions are just the author's meanings and intentions, that theoretical meaning, and the sense in which reading age diaries, you always know that you are reading the work of an author who has literally and actually died, and died in very painful circumstances. So I eventually wrote it around 3 diaries, Eric Michaels' Unbecoming, and 2 video diaries, one from France and one from the United States. France and the United States are very like each other in many ways because they're the 2 countries where the epidemic has hit worst and where it has, the 2 Western countries, I should be quick to say, where it has hit worst, and for the similar reasons, through government stupidity, to put it briefly, unwillingness to make, to adopt sane policies early in the piece. And so they're also the 2 countries where there has been the most witnessing writing in response to the absurdity and the injustice of that situation. So one of the video diaries is by a French writer who became perhaps the principal spokesman for the AIDS epidemic, Hervé Guibert, who simply, he was a man who was interested in photography, but he simply trained a video camera on himself towards the end of his life for several months, and made a sort of home movie of his own very solitary life in that period, which was shown on French TV soon after his death. Is not now available commercially, but there are some copies floating around that you can lay your hands on if you need to. The other video diary is commercially available. It comes from California, Silver Lake Live by Tom Jocelyn. Tom Jocelyn was a video maker himself and a teacher of video, as was his partner, Mark Massey. Both of them were diagnosed with AIDS, and they decided that they would simply show what it looked like. And so they they didn't have to bring cameras into their house. They simply opened their house and their life to the camera and let the camera see what it was like to be facing death from AIDS in California at the end of the 80s, somewhere or other, 1989 or thereabouts, I think it must have been. Those 3 diaries together are the ones that made me, reading them, feel the most anxious about the fact that I was reading the work of an author now not only theoretically but also literally dead. And they started me thinking about what reading means in that context, and that became the overall topic of the book.
One of the interesting things about the book, your book, is this notion of witnessing. In terms of examining the textual afterlife of the narrative, can you explain a little bit more how that works and how that informed your writing of this book?
Sure. Let me see. That withholding of assent that I mentioned earlier can be just a withholding of assent. It may not have any consequences at all but sometimes it has the consequence that the person who is undergoing some horrific event or experience and mentally withholds assent from it, draws the consequence that the story should be told. And then the conditions of the story being told turn out to be you have to survive the experience, at least for a time, long enough to tell the story. But also the story has to survive. The story may not necessarily get out, so to speak. Witnessing, I think, can be described as what happens when someone decides to get out the story, given that the story is going to be received in circumstances very different from the way in which it was conceived, which makes the survival of the story a problematic question. I think of it a little bit in terms of the idea that culture, human culture, has limits, which we don't want to think about, but it does. And its limits are defined by nature, circumstances of dehumanization, what we call dehumanization, animality, death, obviously, is an absolute limit to human culture, and death in atrocious circumstances is a kind of a double whammy from that point of view, because we don't like to think of culture as admitting those kinds of atrocious things. So the problem in a way becomes how within the conventions of culture, what culture allows us to be, to do, to say, how to make known the existence of phenomena, experiences, events that culture, by definition, finds it hard to acknowledge. And so, while writing this book, and since writing it, in fact, I've become increasingly interested in the question of what it takes to do that, what you have to do. And as far as this book is concerned, one of the things that gives writing in those circumstances a kind of authority that it might not otherwise have is the death of the author, the fact that somebody has sanctioned this writing by actually dying, and that the act of dying is written into the writing, so to speak. That gives it a kind of power that my sitting here and talking to you obviously just doesn't have.
Sort of the last words, you know, they always talk about when someone dies, their last words.
That's right.
One of the things that was intriguing to me is that it looked, instead of being a literary critic in the sense of talking about how some text just didn't meet standards of some sort, there was like looking behind the mask of daily existence at the processes that this person was dealing with in shaping the text that came out. And I found that to be very interesting. And as you say, because we're talking about people who are dying, this is an extreme situation, so it carries a drama and an intensity, even in the most mundane details, that would not otherwise be true. So it's almost tragic in that sense. But still, it's just looking behind the mask, watching these processes and what's involved. And it also made me think, and you draw links to other extreme situations like the Holocaust. How do you deal with something that is extreme, you know, in setting up your persona, as you say, denying parts of it in a way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not have never been a big one for evaluative criticism. You know, this is good, that is bad.
Can be a nasty business.
Discriminatory stuff, because it, I suppose fairly early on became evident to me that that it depends what the text is being used for, whether it's a good text or a bad text, so to speak. But in terms of what you're saying, getting behind the scenes of the writing of the text, Eric Michaels is a very helpful writer because he himself is interested in these kinds of questions, discursive questions. He was a cultural anthropologist, so he had to be interested in them, and he'd been working with his friends, the Warlpiri, in Yuendamu, on setting up a TV station, which the Yuendamu wanted to have because they wanted both to protect their own culture from the national culture of Australia, so to speak, and at the same time to have input into the national culture of Australia. They thought, so we'll have a TV station, and they set up their own rather pirate-like TV station, and Eric Michaels had been very closely involved in that work, which in part entailed the Warlpiri thinking, what is the right way for us to have an impact on Warlpiri? There were at the Yuendamu, there were approximately about 150, 200 people in all. What is the right way for us to have our voice heard in the culture of Australia in general? 17 million people, most of them now white Australians. So he'd been thinking about these issues and did clearly, reading between the lines of his book, clearly did a transfer from the Warlpiri to his own situation as an AIDS person, writing a will, a last will and testament, really, and asking himself how that statement of his could be made to survive. And so in his book there's quite a lot of reflection on what he calls the etiquette of making an error, really, making a grammatical error or an error of taste. It's not the kind of thing that people like you to talk about, so how are you going to get to talk about it? And so he was a very important guide to me in many ways. I didn't follow, I guess it's not even true to say I didn't follow his ideas in detail. I certainly took a general framework from him, or absorbed a general framework from him and worked within that. I don't quite know how to generalise the answer. I have the feeling that you can't generalise an answer, and that everybody invents a way of doing this. Everybody who gets caught up in this business invents a way of doing it for themselves and hopes like hell it's going to work, which is the way 99% of things happen in life. Anyway, it's the kind of thing that belongs in the category of what can't be theorized in general terms, but that people know how to do when they have to, I think. And some people know better than others. Some people are more successful at it than others.
Well, one thing that this allowed you to do, or taking this strategy, is it allowed you to look at the person behind, and what was going on with them in all three diaries. And I thought that was very informative, or very revealing, because we're talking some very personal details of their life as things start going more and more wrong, even to the one detail about at what point does the AIDS start even affecting the brain. I mean, so they address that. They say, well, I'm not sure whether the disease is writing this or I'm writing this at some point. There's an enormous frustration and anger and all that going on, but it's informing to see that in that depth and that kind of thing. But also, I thought that this is an extraordinarily well-written book. I've told you that before when we were talking about this interview, that this is a very difficult topic, but the way you did it was in a very sensitive way. It's not macabre, it's not grotesque, it's just presenting it with a real sensitivity to these different lives that were involved, but with also a certain attention to nuance. And you talk about resituating AIDS as part of a complex question of racial and sexual orthodoxies, but it really opens itself up to even broader interpretations because of the precision of your writing. And I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
I can't think of anything to say. It would be very modest, but thank you for saying it on my behalf.
Yeah,
I'm glad I seem to have managed somehow or other to get the right register,
yeah,
or one of the possible right registers.
because it'd be easy to overwrite, to dwell on one aspect or another, you know, and go for a little more dramatic. Certainly, in, excuse me, these days, people are taking all, you know, even allowing the more dramatic elements rather than the more intellectual parts of it.
Yeah.
And each of these people had dramatic circumstances, but they really were trying to make an intellectual point. They're trying to deal with it at a higher level themselves. So I think it's an honor to them to be able to bring that part of it out.
You're revealing something to me that I hadn't thought about before, but is perhaps quite important. I mentioned that I began this work as a memorial to a friend, and I think what you're showing me is that in writing about people I did not know when they were alive, in a sense I came to think of them as friends that I was writing about, because their writing, I suppose the one characteristic of an AIDS diary is that there is a very courageous sacrifice of privacy that goes on there, the kind of things that only your friends are allowed to see or to know about you are the kinds of things that people put in their diary. It's a very personal kind of genre. And so the issue is, yes, how do you write about your friends when your friends have made public aspects of their lives, have deliberately made public and in an ethical way and sometimes with political intentions made public aspects of their lives that are normally private aspects, or at least semi-private. How do you do that? And I'm glad I was just talking a moment ago about the 99% of things we do in life that you can't theorize and that you do anyway as best you can, because I think that's roughly what I did. Temperamentally, I'm not strongly into heavy rhetoric. I think it's perhaps a cultural thing to.
There is a question of the struggling to understand these catastrophes. I think we talked about that somewhat, but
Yeah.
your book does go a long way toward beginning to consider these difficulties and anxieties and impossibilities, as you say, associated with an understanding of reading, witnessing, and mourning.
And in a sense, the AIDS quilt is an example of on behalf of
Right.
witnessing, when the surviving friends and or relatives get together and invent a way of memorializing a person. So I think there's a huge amount of witnessing activity going on. I don't think any of it is much concerned with the problem you were alluding to a moment ago of how to grasp the reality of the thing. There's kind of an illusion that works here, I think, in order to start off trying to tell people what it is like. You have to have a sort of almost naive confidence that you can tell the story like it is, and that people will hear the story like the experience actually is. But when you think of the kind of experience that it is in relation to the means that are available to give an account of it, I think you rather quickly have to figure out that witnessing can't genuinely be about trying to communicate some sense of an ordeal or an atrocity, something obscene, as that thing actually is. It's too huge for one thing. For another thing, the very heart of witnessing is about personal experience, and by definition personal experience is not the same thing as a general experience of something like that, supposing such a thing exists. For another thing, the means aren't there to do it. We just don't have. It's not the way we're culturally equipped. It's not the way things work. So I think the real function is about the anxiety that's created over the inability to do that. The inability either to convey at one end or to grasp at the other end the true depths of something as horrible as the sorts of things we're talking about. And the trick of AIDS witnessing is to transmit that form of anxiety, which, in my opinion, has the consequence, if it succeeds, of forestalling easy closure, the sort of thing you were referring to as dismissal. It's easy to dismiss. And in the end, that's what facing it turns out to mean. It's not. It doesn't particularly matter what content you give to the little word "it" here. What matters is that there be this experience of having encountered something that a form of loss is, I suppose, the quickest definition that I can give to it. Having encountered loss and not being able to just dismiss it, just forget it, just turn away from it and go on with your life as if it had not happened.
Thank you for being on the program.
And thank you for inviting me to appear on the program. And what I hope is that my book will lead people to get hold of some of the diaries that I'm writing about and look at them, read them, think about them, and perhaps go on to read other material as well, and indeed to become aware of the vast mass of cultural material that is now available that tells us what is, more or less, what is happening, or at least keeps us alive to the fact that something is happening.